This video is sponsored by Sunflex UK. My name is Neil and this is Real Life Architecture. And if you watch the channel regularly, you know that I offer consultations to homeowners anywhere in the UK who are thinking of making changes to their property. Now, I was contacted by the owner of this house in England recently, and he wanted to explore the possibility of converting his existing garage. And this threw up an issue that he wasn't expecting. Let me explain. So this is the existing ground floor of the house, and you can see it's got a long, narrow garage, sufficient for 2 cars, probably. That's the upstairs, and there's a floor above as well. So there's 5 bedrooms in this house, and there's a garage that could, at least in theory, accommodate 2 cars. And you can see from the photograph out here that, the driveway, not quite long enough to have 2 cars on it, but you can get 2 cars in that garage, so that's a 3-car space in that house, or in cartilage, that is off-street parking provided for that house. Now, there are no nationally binding planning guidance for car parking spaces, but there's a lot of documentation out there, and each local authority is allowed to make their own decision. And typically, a 5-bedroom house would legally have to have 3 car parking spaces, as this one does. At least in theory, you could put 2 small cars in that garage and a bigger car on that driveway. So if the owner of the house wants to convert their existing garage into a habitable space, which is entirely achievable, we can just insulate it properly, put in the right number of windows to get the amount of daylight and ventilation that's required, and Bob's your uncle, we can convert your garage. It's not an especially complex thing, but you've lost 2 car parking spaces. So I had to explain to him that the planners almost certainly, I don't know for a fact, but almost certainly are going to want those 2 car parking spaces to be replaced somewhere else on his property. And we did identify there was enough space, and down the side here, we could have paved over this, put a drop curb in here, and put a car down the side, and possibly over here as well. He noted that some of the neighbours had done things like this to get more space for cars at the front of their property, and didn't seem to get too much resistance from the planners. Now, some people might ask about permitted development when it comes to garages, because you would think, well, surely it's so simple. You're just going to stick a window in there, maybe a door, and then, from the planning point of view, separate from the building regs, that should be easy. But the problem the planners will have is, where are you parking these cars? Are you now putting them on the street? And keep in mind as well, you can't give personal undertakings. You can't write to the planners and say, I personally promise not to use the house like this. I'll go down to being a single car family and we won't have this problem. The trouble with that is, people die, they go bankrupt, they get divorced, they sell houses, they let houses out, whatever. Once the house is changed, the house as designed must be used in a certain way. And if you get rid of 2 perfectly good spaces in that garage, those cars could still show up and they have to go somewhere. So that's the way the planners look at this. From a practical point of view as well, what he's going to do inside the house, once that problem's been solved, is that you've got a kitchen and you've got a dining and you've got a living area, and then you've got this long garage. And of course, it faces south into a really nice garden, and he wanted to make the best use of this. The client told me he had a budget of no more than £200,000, which is a lot of money in anybody's book, but that can disappear pretty quickly if you start extending and altering inside a house. So what we discussed was the possibility of getting rid of the kitchen and dining over there, and then looking at what we could do with this garage. Now, if you're going to create a habitable space, you have to insulate it. You may wind up having to insulate along the inside surface of that wall. That makes it even narrower. And there comes a point when you can make it habitable, but it's not actually useful. It's too narrow to be of any real use. So you would probably end up having to extend out the way a certain amount. And of course, as soon as you're doing that, you're altering internally as well. That's a load-bearing wall. It's holding up this. So you have, it's doable. It's just more steel. So what I suggested was, create a second living area over here, just so you have a space to go, because this is probably not going to be large enough for the entire family simultaneously, and especially if you have teenage kids. I don't know why, but when I have clients with teenage kids, they always seem to ask for a second living area with a lock on the door. Not always apparent who that lock is for. Coming in here, there's your kitchen, there's a dining next to the kitchen, there's a living area. You could push this wall in and out, and remember, there's always going to be a restriction on the amount of glass you can have in your extension. It's usually 25% new glass per new floor area, plus the area of any windows and doors you're covering over. And what that means in practice is, if you're covering over that window, because that's into a habitable room, that counts. But this window here is not into a habitable room, so they're not going to count that towards your calculation. So the amount of glass you have in your new extension will be 25% the new area. And if you're being generous, you could say, well, we're going to insulate that entire garage floor and the roof and the walls. So yeah, that area there would count towards your 25%. But you have to be kind of careful with that, and that's the building regs. Now, of course, if you're putting in glazing, keep in mind the sponsor of today's video, that's Sunflex UK, and I've used them on several of my own projects, and I really believe they give a great balance between cost and quality. Check out the videos I've made about their products. There's a link in my profile. Now, I know I'm going to get static from this in the comments because I've suggested it before, but you could just walk straight in, but most people seem to prefer the idea of going into a vestibule or hallway and then in from there. But there's nothing to say you couldn't create a vestibule in this area also and split off the kitchen from the dining and the living, but it's a bit more convoluted given how narrow this is. And yes, with enough money, you could take down that entire back corner. You put a steel post here, beam across, and you can prop up the upper floor of the house. It's entirely doable, but it's just more money. I was looking at this from the point of view of how effective can we be without having to just keep blowing the budget? What's the maximum bang for the buck? So if you have a property anywhere in the UK and you're thinking of altering or extending it, you can get my advice before you go any further, because it's best to know certain things like this up front. The guy who was doing this, he hadn't realized there was an implication with respect to parking on site, but you know, it's manageable. In this is not a listed building, it's not in a conservation area. It ought to be feasible to drop a curb over here or to pave over this area to get more space for cars in front of his house without having to park them on the street. But keep in mind, each local authority has the power to interpret this guidance themselves, so there's no one size fits all national policy that we have to apply to this. The building regs are national, but planning, that's local. So let me know what you think of that in the comments.